Hello, my name is Alahmadi, and I am a first-year doctoral student in the Assessment and Measurement program at JMU. My advisor, Dr. Christine Demars, and I have been researching the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic on large-scale assessment. And today, I will present to you our findings from JMU's Remote Assessment Day. James Madison University has been assessing the effectiveness of university-wide programs for every cohort for more than 30 years, with a main focus on improving student learning and development. To do this, JMU dedicates 2 assessment days, during which several measures of specified student learning outcomes are administered to students. All incoming students are required to participate in the Fall Assessment Day. After completing 45 to 70 credit hours, this group of students is assessed a second time on the Spring Assessment Day. Students are assessed on several general education subjects, including history, global issues, and science. A typical assessment day at JMU involves in-person, proctored testing sessions during which students are administered several paper and pencil and computer-based assessments. Different groups of students complete different configurations of tests during a 2-hour session. Proctors on assessment days play a critical role during the testing sessions. Aside from their role in maintaining a quiet and appropriate testing environment, they also emphasize the importance of assessment to students and encourage them to put forth their best effort. Assessment days at JMU adopted this structure for years. But in 2020, some things had to change. A report published by the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment revealed that 97% of 813 higher education assessment professionals indicated that changes to their assessment were necessitated in response to COVID-19. At JMU, this meant that major modifications were not only made at the course level, but also at the university level. For the first time, Fall Assessment Day in 2020 was conducted completely remotely due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Another major change was the absence of proctors. The format of testing changed from paper and pencil to computer-based only. Also, instead of being tested on a specific day, students were allowed a 3-week window to complete the assessments via links they received by email. How might all these modifications affect the results of Assessment Day? Assessment Day testing is considered low-stakes testing because students' performance bears no direct personal consequences. So, what does low-stakes testing entail when conducted remotely? Well, in low-stakes testing, examinees may be less inclined to cheat, but they may also be less inclined to put forth much effort, especially considering the absence of proctors who play an important role in motivating students. Also, conducting low-stakes assessment remotely increases the likelihood of issues related to unstandardized testing conditions, such as environmental noise and technological issues. Some studies that compared examinee performance on applied and cognitive tests in proctored versus unproctored online settings found no significant differences between the two. Conversely, there is evidence of higher performance in online remote cognitive tests when they were unproctored as opposed to proctored. As you can see, current empirical evidence is mixed on whether unproctored online tests affect assessment results. And so we asked, how would low-stakes remote testing affect the results of large-scale assessment, like the one we conduct here at JMU? Specifically, we had 2 research questions. Our first question was, do students tested remotely in fall 2020 score comparably to students tested in person in the previous cohorts? Our second question was, do students tested remotely in fall 2020 report test-taking effort similar to the effort reported by students tested in person in the previous cohorts? JMU's long-standing assessment model allowed us to look at differences in performance and effort between the previous 4 cohorts of incoming students tested in an in-person, proctored, paper and pencil administration versus the most recent cohort of incoming students tested in an online, unproctored administration in fall 2020. We examined students' scores on the following assessment instruments. Knowledge of history is assessed using a 40-item test with a possible number correct score range of 0 to 40. Knowledge of global issues is assessed by 31 items with a possible number correct score range of 0 to 31. Scientific reasoning is assessed by 66 items with a possible range for number correct score between 0 and 66. Lastly, effort and motivation are measured by a 5-item survey. Students indicate their agreement level with statements regarding how much effort they expended while taking the tests on a 5-point Likert scale, ranging from 1, strongly disagree, to 5, strongly agree. The possible total score range is 1 to 5, averaging across the 5 items. Here's what we found. With respect to performance, we see, at a first glance, a pattern of decreasing scores over the years on the history and global issues tests, but fluctuating scores on the scientific reasoning test, with a large drop in 2020. The linear trends we observe on history and global issues were statistically significant. That is, on these 2 tests, the 2020 group did not show a decrease beyond the linear trend that was already happening over time. On the scientific reasoning test, there was not a clear linear trend prior to 2020. What we observe, however, is that the 2020 group exhibited a more drastic decrease. A contrast analysis between the mean of the 2020 group and the mean of the previous years showed that 2020 scores were significantly different. Additional information about student test performance can be gained by examining the distribution of scores. In these figures, the red dashed line represents the score distribution for the 2016 through 2019 cohorts, whereas the blue solid line represents the distribution for the 2020 cohort. On the history and global issues assessments, the score distributions of both groups of cohorts look similar. On the scientific reasoning assessment, we see that not only did the score distribution for the 2020 cohort shift lower, but it also changed shape. The mode of the distribution in 2020 was located just below the mode of previous cohorts. And there was a secondary mode of lower scores, which shows that a substantial portion of the 2020 incoming students scored much lower than previous cohorts. Could the interaction between cohort and assessment subject be due to differences in effort? Similar amount of effort was reported by all 5 cohorts on all assessments. Slightly lower levels of effort were reported in 2020 across all assessments, but they did not seem to deviate much from previous cohorts. This figure of mean effort scores does not give a full comparison of effort across cohorts. So let's take a look at density plots of effort scores. The 2020 cohort's effort appears to be bimodal, especially in the scientific reasoning test. In 2020, there was a larger bump in students responding 3 or neutral on the 5-point Likert scale. This bump may be related to the greater density of the very low scores on the scientific reasoning that we looked at a moment ago. JMU's Remote Assessment Day was an exceptional opportunity to examine performance differences due to testing settings in low-stakes educational assessment. We compared the results of Fall 2020 Remote Assessment Day with those obtained from the previous 4 cohorts to control for any pre-existing trends. In terms of mean performance, students tested remotely in 2020 followed the preceding trend of decreasing scores on the history and global issues assessments. But they scored significantly lower on the scientific reasoning test than their counterparts in previous years. In terms of effort, students tested remotely in 2020 exhibited a typical distribution of effort scores on history and global issues, but showed a different distribution of effort scores on the scientific reasoning test. Our results suggest that the differences in performance and effort observed in students who tested remotely in 2020 can be ascribable to differences in test types. Recall that the scientific reasoning test is longer than the other two tests. It has 66 items versus 31 items for global issues and 40 items for history. Also, science tends to be perceived as more difficult by students. The different patterns we observed in performance and effort may be attributable to the higher cognitive demand of the scientific reasoning test. Our results indicate that performance on online, unproctored assessments may be significantly impacted on the more arduous tests. That is, tests that require higher-order reasoning or contain a large number of items. Accordingly, assessment practitioners in higher education are encouraged to consider the amount of cognitive resources demanded by the tests they administer online.